Digital Business and the co-founder of the International Institute for Analytics, as well as a senior advisor to Deloitte Analytics. I know I'm making him uncomfortable with these introductions, but I have to say that, in all honesty, Tom was writing about data before it was big and before it was sexy. He's been writing about data for a long time and about analytics. He pioneered the concept of competing on analytics with his best-selling book in 2006. Actually, it was an article, Harvard Business Review article, and then a book. His most recent book, Keeping Up with the Quants, Your Guide to Understanding and Using Analytics, with Jin-Ho Kim. And he's written or edited 15 other books, over 100 articles for many very high-profile publications in the management area, as well as analytics, enterprise systems, information management. He was named, in 2003, he was named one of the world's top 25 consultants by Consulting Magazine, and in 2005, Optimize Magazine, the readers named him among the top 3 business technology analysts in the world. Should I keep going? I'll skip to 2012.
One of the first 2 is dead, so I think I should move up, don't you think? You know?
Move up the ladder, I like it. And I have to read it all. In 2007-8, he was named one of the, and 2008, he was named one of the 100 most influential people in the IT industry by the Ziff Davis magazines. And in 2012, he was named one of the world's top 50 business school professors by Fortune magazine. Please join me in welcoming Tom Davenport.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here. I've sort of followed from afar the iSchool's creation and transformation, and I always thought it was a really neat idea to have a school built around information. Kind of think of myself as a sociologist of business information. I don't think that the American Sociological Association has recognized that as a specialty area yet, and I don't go to, not yet, any day now, and I don't go to too many of the sociology meetings, but information and how people and organizations make effective use of it, if there's anything that's sort of common throughout my somewhat bizarre set of topics that I pursued, that's it. And so it's great to be at a place where that's kind of the key focus. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is new stuff. It's early days for it. I have some research, but as I sometimes say, it's Jesse Jackson once said there are tree shakers and there are jelly makers. I think he said that in a sort of flattering way to say that he was a tree shaker. I will do it in the same self-serving way. I'm certainly not a good jelly maker academically. I normally get bored after a couple of years in a topic and move on, but this particular topic of analytics and big data, there's so much fruit on the tree that it has been too hard to abandon, as I think many of you will recognize. So I started working on analytics. Most recently I was focused on knowledge management related issues until about a decade ago, and then I sort of started getting bored with that and got interested in what I thought of as sort of knowledge derived from data, and couldn't get any of the knowledge management people interested in the topic. They were mostly interested in unstructured content. I guess they're coming full circle now and are fashionable again in that sense. But so I started doing some work in this area. I actually published one of the few pieces I ever did in California Management Review on this, and nobody paid any attention whatsoever. And so then I published some other stuff on analytics. People started to get interested, I think not because of me, just because the zeitgeist was right for it. And then I sort of thought, okay, well, I've pretty much done that. And then the whole big data thing came along. It was about last quarter of 2010. If you look at Google trends. It really, you don't see it so much on this graph, but that's when it really started to take off. I confess that I initially thought, well, I've sort of done that. You know, I did this stuff on analytics. This is about analytics. What's a big deal? I briefly considered, as some people have done, doing a global replace in all my work on analytics of the word analytics with the words big data. Voila, several new books. I looked very productive, but then I thought, well, maybe I should do some research and see whether there really are any differences, and I found out there were. About 2 years ago, I started doing some research on data scientists. I'm always really interested in who are the kinds of people who are doing this sort of work, and I interviewed, 25 or 30 of them, and wrote an article. I think I inadvertently contributed to the hype around data scientists because our Harvard Business Review editors subtitled this article, "The Sexiest Job of the 21st Century." I keep having to remind people, not sexiest people, sexiest job of the 21st century. I've actually heard wolf whistles after some data scientists because of this article. But the article was slightly problematic, and the research was slightly problematic because I was funded in doing this research by a company that does analytical software, SaaS. They've been very nice to fund a lot of my research over the years, including my initial competing on analytics research. And most of the people I talked to, these data scientists in the Bay Area, for the most part, we have a few in Boston as well, but more out here than any place else, none of them use SaaS. They were all into open source, RRR. So I didn't put that in the article exactly, but when I told them, not too many people are interested in SaaS, they said, well, maybe you should do another study looking at big companies, which I was interested in doing too. So what these little text boxes are about is big data clearly began at online companies like Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and Yahoo and so on, and seemed to go pretty well in almost every respect for those organizations. They didn't really have an existing technology or information infrastructure to combine it with. It was sort of all that there was, so you didn't have to worry about coexistence at all. But how about these other organizations, big companies, if you will? I mostly teach at Babson. I'm a bit of a charlatan because Babson always wins #1 in entrepreneurship, as we did again in the U.S. News and World Report. But I mostly work with big companies. Occasionally I will say, I don't know that much about entrepreneurship, and the president will say, shh, quiet, don't say that. But I was quite interested in how about, how's this combination working out, and is it really revolutionizing big companies as well, and what do they think about it, people who have been doing information, data, analytics for a long time. So I interviewed with a woman named Jill Deshay about 22 of these companies, I think, and I've talked to a number since. I talked to a couple more today who kind of reiterated the pattern, and it suggests to me that we need a new way of thinking about analytics within organizations that is highly influenced by the big data movement, but not exactly the same as it. So I'm going to talk about what I call Analytics 3.0. Let me say a little bit about this study overall, and then I'll get to 1.0 and 2.0. So these are the companies that I interviewed, big names, some from out here, some East Coast, some in the middle, I think all US. The criterion for being a part of this study was that you had to be doing something with big data. You had to have some initiative underway, and we ended up talking to a number who said, oh, sorry, we're not there yet. One of the first questions that I asked was, what do you think of this big data thing? almost all of them, not 100%, a person I was talking to today from a health insurance company said the same thing. He said, yeah, it's kind of amusing because we've been working with big data for a long time. There's been certainly a progression. The amount of data is growing. In a way, the unstructured nature of the data is more important than the size. But people tended to think this has been something that's been around for a while. I heard last week, I was talking about analytics up at Microsoft, and one of the other speakers had a nice little analogy. People talk, as you probably know, about the 3 V's for big data: volume, variety, and velocity. He said, this is nothing new. Cockroaches have the 3 V's. They are apparently quite voluminous. One female cockroach can have 150 offspring. There are a lot of varieties, 5,000 different species of cockroaches, and apparently if cockroaches were as big as cheetahs, which is a sobering prospect, they would be able to travel at 50 miles per hour. So I never really liked that 3V thing. I always thought, what if you only have 1V? It doesn't, are you kind of out of the running? But I thought it was a neat twist on that classification. However, despite the fact that people seemed a little jaded, they were excited about what you could do, particularly with this new unstructured data that seem to be analyzable now. But their rationales for embarking on their big data initiatives seem to be pretty similar to the general things that people do with IT. Faster, better, cheaper, etc. Faster decisions. So the guy who heads Macy's.com, who's here in San Francisco, said, we can reprice all of our, not just Macy's.com, but all of Macy's SKUs. Used to take us 22 hours. Now it takes us half an hour or so. Now, one could imagine that with that kind of ability to reprice very quickly, you could say, well, what's the weather going to be like today? Shorts weather in San Francisco, so let's reprice all of our merchandise a little up on shorts so we make some more money. Obviously, we have to get into digital signage and things like that to be able to do that kind of process very quickly, but it's sort of appealing. Caesars, which is the world's largest gaming firm, still, former business school professor, a friend of mine, Gary Loveman, is the CEO and has been a very aggressive adopter of analytics along the way. Helped them out a lot, I think. But now they're saying, well, we need to do this much faster. They've concluded that if you've just signed up for their loyalty program, frequent gambler program, and you're standing at a slot machine and you're losing your first time, your chances of returning are only about 10% to any Harrahs Casino, because you think, this place has bad luck. However, if while you're there, they see that you're having a bad time, they see that your chances of returning are not very good, if they spit out a little coupon for you to go over to the buffet and have some free food on them, not only are you likely to sort of regress to the mean when you come back and do a little bit better, your chances are 40% higher of returning. But you have to spit it out while they're there. Mailing it after they leave apparently has very little impact. Hence the need for speed in that regard. There's some organizations that are in this just for lower cost, and I'll show some numbers later. Certainly Hadoop-based data management and processing architectures are an awful lot cheaper. Orders of magnitude in some cases, at least one order of magnitude. Not directly comparable yet, I think, in terms of the sort of data hygiene that large organizations want, the security, the reliability, the data privacy concerns, and so on. but awfully appealing. And companies like Citi, which are quite interested these days in saving money, given what's happened in the banking industry, find this too appetizing to pass up. Then you have organizations saying, I want to make better decisions. So this healthcare company that I talked to today, which was not United, and United, all of these health insurance companies now have discovered consumers. You may have noticed. They want to be nice to consumers all of a sudden. It used to be we bought our insurance through our employer and nobody cared about consumers, but that's all starting to change with healthcare regulation and so on. And so they care about consumers. United Healthcare discovered, there might be some pretty good clues to how happy consumers are in the call center tapes that we keep. Those are speech, of course, but we can convert it to text and then analyze the text. And if somebody says, I hate you, United Healthcare, that may be a good indication that they want to leave. It's not rocket science there. So they added it to their predictive algorithms. It turns out it was a good predictor of unhappiness and potential attrition, and so they have a better decision. But I think the highest and best usage of big data is product and service innovation. I think it's always been the highest and best use of information technology. What can we do to create new products and services? Certainly in the Bay Area, in these online and startup firms, data products are what it's all about. If you go to LinkedIn, they're churning out new data products all the time. Our poster child example in that data scientist article in Harvard Business Review was People You May Know in LinkedIn, created by this guy Jonathan Goldman, a physicist who wandered into LinkedIn and said, people might like to know something about former schoolmates and workmates and so on. Let's try to make this happen. Larger companies, I think, are not quite as much into that space, but in the East Bay, I don't know, anybody from GE passed through here? Bill Rue, for example, the head of this big new center in the East Bay, Pleasanton, to do software, big data analytics. They're churning out data services by the score, and I'll talk about them later on. Novartis doing it in healthcare. I recently looked at a number of companies that were doing this all over 100 years old. Bosch. How many of you really grew up wanting to work for Robert Bosch and Co.? But they're doing fantastically interesting stuff about intelligent transportation systems. Schneider Electric, which was a 150-year-old or so French armaments maker originally, now doing some really interesting stuff in smart grid areas. GE's over 100 years old. UPS is over 100 years old. Procter & Gamble, 176 years old. I'll talk about them later. So it seemed to me that this combination of activities that resemble big data and activities that resemble traditional analytics are kind of resulting in a new combination of stuff, which is why I think a new paradigm is necessary. So Analytics 1.0, I think we're pretty much all familiar with. I will stereotype it a bit probably, but I think these are mostly accurate attributes, primarily about reporting, producing standard reports or scorecards or dashboards or maybe queries, ad hoc queries if you're lucky. Very oriented to, of course, structured small data. Nobody likes to say, oh, I work with small data. But it's one of the reasons why I don't think the term big data is going to last for a long time, because its opposite means nothing to most people. Analysts in the small data, traditional analytics era were traditionally quite sort of back office, not so oriented to interactions with carbon-based life forms, very good at churning out analytics, but not in the driver's seat in any way with regard to strategy or anything. And the focus was internal decision support. I think Still, that term is used in some industries, healthcare in particular. It was the kind of the core of the analytics movement. We called it decision support systems, and it was about internal decisions that senior managers needed to make. That was, of course, the period where we discovered the data warehouse. It was quite successful, almost too successful in some organizations. We ended up basically putting everything that moved into data warehouses, very good for organizations like Teradata and so on that sold these things, but after you put a lot in, it becomes quite difficult to figure out how to get it all out. There were other technologies, not quite as ancient as this graphic would suggest, but spreadsheets, I think, very key aspect of Analytics 1.0. Quite still, I can attest from being up at Microsoft last week, still quite popular, but have a lot of errors. Some people suggest 20% or so errors is the likelihood in a spreadsheet. And obviously people have different versions of the truth throughout an organization. We have this idea of the business intelligence or analytics package with a lot of different functionality embedded in it, and it was up to the user to sort of figure out which one made sense for him or her. If you've ever done, use SAS or SPSS, it's up to you to decide, well, do I need a proc reg here or proc ANOVA or whatever? And many people, let's face it, didn't have the ability to make that choice. Tools for extract, transform, and load of data was very tedious and time-consuming. Online analytical processing cubes that sort of pre-digested data elements, which is great as long as you only wanted those, but if you wanted to venture outside them, it was very, very tough. And then all of our servers, of course, were on-premise, not in the cloud in those days. So there was kind of an ethos about this, is sort of stay in the back room, as far from decision makers as possible, don't cause a lot of trouble, don't rock the boat too much. Take your time, nobody's that interested in what you're going to come up with anyway. It's a bit of a stereotype, but I think there is some truth to that in many cases. We talked a lot about this so-called BI for the masses, but it was really too complex for most people to be able to navigate effectively, both the analytical options and the complexity of the data warehouse. Look backwards, because that's where the threats to your business are. Of course, that's what reporting is all about. It's only backward looking. If possible, spend more time getting data ready for analysis and actually analyzing it. Unfortunately, that's still something that carries over a bit. But I was talking today to this guy in the health insurance company, and he said, we had this venture in the Blue Cross Blue Shield organizations called Blue Health Intelligence. Anybody familiar with that? Cranked up in 2005, and the idea is we're going to pull data from all of these different Blue Cross Blue Shield organizations. We'll have millions and millions of lives to analyze. That's the word they use in that industry, and we'll find out fantastic stuff about what makes people sick and what makes them well. And so now we're 8 years into this, and they're still trying to integrate the data across these millions and millions of lives. It's a very complex thing, but this, I think, was a real problem. Stay inside the sheltering confines of the IT organization. We wouldn't want to sort of get out there with business people too much. And so I think all of these were sort of good building blocks to where we want to go, but not something we necessarily want to stick with. So all of a sudden around, 2002 or 3 in the Silicon Valley companies, later for everybody else, as the rest of the world noticed, about 2010 or so, we had this big data idea coming along which involved, obviously large, complex, unstructured data sources, some new analytical and computational capabilities, things like Hadoop. The idea of a data scientist starts to emerge. And then you have, to me, the most interesting thing is you have all these online and startup firms saying, it's not about internal decisions so much anymore. It's about data-based products and service offerings. So a very different set of objectives, different places in the organization where these people would work, and different sort of culture as well. So some of these data products, of course, Google is full of them. I was once talking to Hal Varian, your predecessor, and he said, I said, how many data scientists do you have at Google? And he said, well, that's a tough question, because after all, we're in the data business. I mean, you can, for your study, you can say 600, but arguably a lot more. LinkedIn, I mentioned PYMK, fantastically successful at drawing people in to LinkedIn. By the way, if you're ever looking to waste time, I don't know if you know this, but people you may know just kind of goes on forever. It just keeps on suggesting. So if you're bored with, whatever you're doing, it's a fantastic way to entertain yourself and say, how do they know that I know that person? And do I know that person? You can speculate endlessly. Lots of other ones that they've created. Netflix has some great ones, of course. I was talking to Stan Humphries last week, the chief economist of Zillow. He said, Zestimates, this estimate of what your house is worth, fantastically successful at bringing people into Zillow. You don't have to want to sell your house to say, well, wonder what my house is worth. And they have some other ones as well. And of course, Facebook has a number. Facebook has been quite as successful as some of these other organizations with data products, but I think they sort of get it now. I don't think Yahoo has been either, but my sense is they get it now too. The ethos, very different. DJ Patil, has he passed through here? I'm sure he has. He's everywhere. He's my co-author on this data scientist piece. He was very frustrated with me because he kept saying, data scientists need to be on the bridge, closely advising Captain Kirk. And I said, oh, you mean like Dr. Spock? He says, no, not a dead baby doctor. It's Mr. Spock. He was, I think, lost a lot of respect for me when I said that. But I think he's a Trekkie and really thinks of himself as closely advising the Captain Kirks of the world. People said to me, Agile, we tried that, but it's a little too slow. We needed faster evolution of our data products and services, and so we needed some new methods that weren't quite as slow as Agile. Somebody said being a consultant, that's kind of like the dead zone, I think. Because what you really want to do, you don't want to create a presentation or, God forbid, a memo. You want to create a product or a service, at least a demo, which, very different mindset than with Analytics 1.0. Very strong focus on open source, of course, in that community. I don't think anybody's done a huge total cost of ownership analysis of these open source tools, but it's just very compelling that the stuff is free, and increasingly I think people view storage and processing as almost free, if not totally free. Whatever problem you have, you can solve it in a hackathon. Close the door, slide pizzas under every couple of hours, you'll be fine in the morning. There is that assumption, and to their credit, they don't just take from the community, they give back in terms of donating tools to the Apache Foundation and so on. So very different mindset, as you can see, an overall feeling of, we're breaking new ground here. One of these data scientists said to me, if we wanted to deal with structured data, we'd have gone to Wall Street. He didn't say that salaries were way down on Wall Street and they're not hiring quite as many physicists as they used to be, but there's a general feeling we're really doing something new and exciting in this 2.0 environment. Of course, a very different sort of data environment involving Hadoop as kind of the central tool, if you will, for breaking up these complex problems and running them on multiple commodity servers and then reassembling them, of course. But as I said, these big companies said, we don't want to take the 2.0 thing out of the box. So I would argue that we're kind of entering just now a new period of thinking about how we organize and manage analytics, which is sort of a blend of traditional analytics and big data, where analytics are integral to running the business and a strategic asset. So everybody can be an analytical competitor now. Very rapid and agile insight delivery, analytical tools being pushed to the point of decision, and we are embedding analytics into much of what we do. And I think that the time is probably now for this in the most sophisticated organizations. Again, most of the kind of 3.0 oriented companies I have found are in the US, but I have talked to some in Europe, and Bob Cole told me today people are getting quite excited about big data in Japan, so it probably won't be too long there. Supposedly, I wrote a foreword for a big data book in China, and the guy who wrote it, somebody told me later that I should not have written this because it was a very bad book, and of course I couldn't read Mandarin, so I didn't really know, but he told me it sold over 2 million copies, so there must be a lot of interest in the topic. So in this environment, not just these online companies, but every company can create data and analytics-based products and services. So some of you who are as old as I am may recall that this is not a new discussion. There was a guy lived in the Boston area named Stan Davidson. There was a California guy named Bill Davidson and Stan Davis. They were co-authors on this book called 2020 Vision more than 20 years ago, and they said, we need to start informationalizing our organizations, and we should use data exhaust. I think I have a point there about that, to really develop information-based products and services. But I went back and looked at the examples that they use. It's all sort of information industry stuff. They talk about Quotron and Bloomberg and the official airline guide and so on. But now you're starting to look at companies like Bosch and Schneider and GE, and they're saying, we can do this too. We can play in the data economy. When I ask people who are doing this, do you sort of start with the data that you have available, or do you start with the sort of business problems of your organization and its customers? And they all say, yes, we do both, and we hope that they kind of meet up in the center. Not a whole lot of method to the madness yet, but people seem to be working along multiple fronts. To do this well, I think you have some new capabilities that are required. You go to a LinkedIn, for example, they have this data products group, and they're very good at not only data science, but they meet with their customers a lot. They know what stage gates are in product development. It's sort of the intersection of traditional product development and data science, if you will. Interestingly enough, you could argue that some of the 2.0 companies like LinkedIn are moving into 3.0 as well, because they have discovered small data analytics. They are quite focused on how do we improve the marketing calls that we do at LinkedIn, and how do we predict customer attrition and all those things that the sort of 1.0 companies were doing before they were started. And this all has to move very quickly. I don't know if the big companies are going to say that agile is too slow, but they certainly don't want traditional kind of waterfall methods of analytical development. So this is my attempt actually to dazzle the people at Microsoft with my use of PowerPoint. So it usually works. So in terms of data types, we had all of this very structured transaction data. And then we said, okay, but we also need more analytical data, purchasing behavior, recommendation, sentiment analysis, lifetime value, that sort of thing. But now, I hate this out-of-the-box phrase, but I think we could argue we're sort of out of the box in terms of data types, that every conceivable thing you could imagine could be included in the big data environment, and we have to think all of it's big data. Some of it may be a lot smaller than others, some is more structured than others, but together it constitutes big data. I did get a little applause for this at Microsoft. I don't know if they just felt sorry for me or what, but I will take it as praise. So the other question becomes, what do you do to, where do you put this stuff? Still a data warehouse? Well, sort of. But I think we have a very interesting development happening in this regard. And I first observed this actually across the bay at Wells Fargo. So I was talking to Wells Fargo because they had bought a tool that Teradata sells now. They acquired this company, Aster Data. Aster Data is a, they call it a data development environment. It's sort of, you know, if you're going to do product development based on data, you need some place to kind of screw around with the stuff for a while without a whole lot of obstacles. But then they said, yeah, we have Hadoop as well. This is intended to show the somewhat informal nature of Hadoop, bunch of servers sitting on a desktop with a manual. And they said, we still have our Teradata warehouse, the one over here. We call this one Teradata Heavy. This is also kind of a more data mart, smaller, less security. Teradata Light, we call that. So these are now 4 places where we put data for analytics. Used to be there was 1, maybe 2 if companies were really sophisticated. And of course, I think Wells Fargo is a well-managed organization. They don't have yet a well-defined process for sort of what goes where, when, but they are kind of working on it. And I think and this is not all of the possibilities. We could, of course, have graph databases and columnar databases and so on. And knowing sort of what goes where under what circumstances, I think is going to preoccupy data management people for quite a number of years. But obviously there's some increased functionality involved too. So what else in terms of technologies and people? A lot of not just this centralized stuff, but saying if we're going to get really good at analytics, we need to sort of push it out to the front lines. I once saw this application at Merck. It was really more of an app that I thought was really quite symbolic of what you can do with this stuff. It was a little app for what to do if a salesperson leaves. You're a sort of field sales territory manager. One of your salespeople leaves. Do you replace him or her, or do you just stay with what you have? It seems like a fairly small decision, but it adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars spread out over the globe. You could have done it before if you were analytically savvy enough, but now with this app, which runs on an iPad or an iPhone or something like that, it's sort of put in a couple of numbers relative to your situation, and voila, you get an answer back. Yes, you should hire, or no, you shouldn't. And I think increasingly we're going to see pushing analytics out like that. It may not even appear to be analytics for a lot of people, but it's certainly a form of data product integrated with the way people do their work and make decisions. The whole data discovery, data development environment, I think is going to be very critical here. Again, I think we're just, I'm doing a little research project on that now, interviewing companies who have set up one, asking them why they do it. They all seem to have drunk the Kool-Aid in a very big way. Many of them have only gotten this 2 or 3 months ago, but they just want to tell me story after story of the kind of benefit that they have gotten from it in the very short time they've had it. Visual analytics, I know there are a lot of people here who do visual analytics. Maybe somebody, when we can have a Q&A period, you can answer for me, why exactly in the big data environment have visual analytics taken off? Because I must confess I'm slightly puzzled by this. I think visual analytics are a great way to sort of communicate with humans about what's going on in data, but they were before as well. I think it may be that it's somewhat coincidental that there have been a lot of new developments in visual analytics at the same time that big data has come along. the skeptic in me, when I was talking to DJ Patil about my research on these data scientists, I said, you know, DJ, a lot of these people are not doing very sophisticated analytics. It's kind of descriptive statistics on big data. And he said, yes, you've discovered the big data equals small math phenomenon. So I think, you know, in the early stages of big data, it is so hard to kind of structure the data and get anything out of it, even descriptive statistics, that we sort of feel, you know, maybe some nice pictures are enough. But you know, maybe there's another factor, but it's, as I say, it's somewhat puzzling to me at the moment. I think we will get to more sophisticated math for big data before too long. And you know, the problem, of course, with we humans is we don't do too well once you get into visual representations of very complex mathematical models. It's the simple stuff that I think works best with our eyes. The 3.0 companies that I talk to, I say, well, you know, do you have a big data department? Do you have a data science department? No, we just kind of blend them all in. And somewhat to my surprise, nobody seems too worried about being able to find a ton of data scientists. I know you're launching a program in this, and I think it's obviously a great idea, but you know, they want to train some people, they want to hire some people, but the huge shortage that people talk about seems to be much less worrisome to these large companies than it does to, you know, the small Bay Area firms and the online firms. But they all seem to be blended together and not separate at all. More and more chief analytics officers. I mean, obviously, if analytics are key to your business, then you want to have people who know how to do it, who are the primary advocates for it within the organization. I met one last week at FICO. There's one now down at Schwab. In some cases, you have these chief digital officers or chief data officers that are that at Wells Fargo, the chief digital officer effectively incorporates analytics and the online channels. There was, who was that guy? Oh yeah, Obama. I think he had a chief analytics officer, and it seemed to work pretty well for him in his campaign. Everything is increasingly prescriptive. Everything is faster. I was quite interested in fact, I think I was visiting my son here in Berkeley, and I was interviewing on the phone this guy at Schneider National, not Schneider Electric, but Schneider National, big transportation company. You've seen their orange trucks probably. And he was telling me, I think I was getting your car fixed in Oakland. I don't know why I remember this, but he was telling me they now have fuel sensors that will tell truck drivers where to stop and get fuel. Used to be they trusted the truck driver, you know, it's getting low, time to go in. But apparently truck drivers were choosing fuel stops. I won't say the reasons why they chose them, but it was on the basis of things other than low fuel prices, I'm told. Now they tell the truck drivers where to stop. They also have predictive models for when a truck driver is likely to have an accident. So can you imagine, you know, sorry, Bob, you're going to have to go on furlough. Your predictive models suggest you're going to have an accident over the next couple of weeks. Bob complains, but I haven't had an accident. You can't punish me for something that hasn't happened. Well, yes, we can, because our model suggests you are on the verge of an accident. And you know, they have things like if you've had, they can monitor hard stops. If you've had a couple of hard stops over the last week, apparently that's a really bad sign. If you've, you know, exceeded the speed limit, all of this can be remotely is remotely monitored now. When I was looking at UPS to try to figure out when UPS really started on this telematics journey. So I was doing a search for UPS and telematics. The vast majority, if you try it out if you want, the vast majority of returned content was from Teamsters who are complaining, as you might imagine, about telematics at UPS. Again, telling them where to stop, where to go, where to turn, etc. Everything is faster with new technologies. Got in-memory analytics, got in-database processing, where instead of swapping things in and out of disk, you're keeping it all in memory, and of course dividing it up over all these servers in a rack like this one. So that I think is a big factor in the appeal, and everything seems to be much cheaper as well. This was one company that didn't want to reveal itself, but $37,000 a terabyte for a year in a traditional database environment, $5,000 in an appliance, $2,000 in Hadoop. So pretty dramatic savings. And I've seen some other analyses that have been similar. Of course, as I said, there's not direct comparability between the sort of traditional database environment and the Hadoop environment in terms of the things that you care about with databases other than pure performance. So GE, of course, down in Pleasanton. Do you think, they always say, oh, we think we can get all the data scientists we want because we're on the East Bay and we're going to avoid all the traffic in Silicon Valley. That wouldn't seem to be that powerful a motivator. Doing some really interesting things around what they call things that spin, locomotives, jet engines, gas turbines, putting sensors in all of them. By the way, I don't know if you have a course here in structuring the data out of gas turbines, but if you did, apparently GE would hire every one of you. Not too many people know about that, apparently, but I think the brilliance of this move is that GE and these industrial products businesses gets half of its revenue from services. And if you can restructure service agreements, so we're servicing only when it's absolutely necessary based on sensors registering something being too hot or vibrating too much. GE is even doing this to try to reposition itself from being a product company to a services company. They are selling, for example, in jet engines, they are selling not the engine itself, but we've all heard of software as a service. They are selling thrust as a service now. So don't worry about, we'll just provide you with a certain amount of thrust and over a certain amount of time, and don't worry, it'll be there. You'll be, paying by what's the unit of thrust? I don't know. But it's a very revolutionary idea, and they started now to sell this capability to other organizations. When an organization like GE gets creative from a marketing standpoint, they've copyrighted the term Datalandia, in case any of you were thinking about it. Predicity, which I think is short for Prediction City, I'm not sure. Anyway, but this is what happens when you get a big company like that into database products and services. P&G, I think, is doing some things with big data, but is really quite impressive at using data to make better decisions. And you probably heard about these rooms that they have. They call them business suites, where most of them are business spheres, they call them. Most of them are square or rectangular. I don't know why they call them spheres. The one in Cincinnati, where their headquarters is spherical, like a football-shaped room covered with screens. And the idea is, not just the idea, the reality, managers, senior managers sit in it and make decisions about how to run their business with data and analytics. And then they push a lot of that data out to over 50,000 desktops as well. It's I think, the best thought out environment. We've had these sort of decision cockpits over the years. They've never really taken off, but at P&G it's quite impressive, and they actually have applied for a patent on it. They may be into the data products business themselves in this regard. They do some big data analysis of consumer sentiment, and that's part of what they push out to these cockpits and to these spheres. Novartis, I mentioned in the drug development space in Cambridge, Mass, where I live. We have the Novartis Institutes for is it biomedical sciences or Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research. And I mean, if we had newspaper help wanted ads anymore, they would be full of ads for bioinformaticians. It's just unbelievable how many of those people work in the Kendall Square area. In fact, I think, you know, it really changes the whole Silicon Valley Route 128 equation. I was thinking if I were interested enough, I would write a book about Kendall Square because it's unbelievably booming right now. Of course, we lost out in IT, but we seem to be doing okay in the healthcare space. Schneider, I mentioned, predictive analytics or prescriptive analytics on all kinds of things. It starts to change, I think, the dynamic between the worker and the supervisor in a pretty dramatic way. Same at UPS. UPS said, you know, we've been doing this stuff for a long time, but now we're finally putting it to work in terms of they are redesigning their route structure for only the third time in their 107-year history. And before long, we'll be able to, as the driver is, you know, UPS drivers go the same route every day until very soon, and they're going to be dynamically reconfiguring routes as people drive. As you can imagine, prescriptive analytics pretty high premium on reliability. If you start moving drivers around and sending them down one-way streets or to addresses that don't exist, let's just say those Teamsters websites are not going to be happy. When I was up at Microsoft last week, Microsoft I think has a lot of activity in big data and analytics, but let's just say it is somewhat fragmented. They were somewhat surprised to see that 1,000 people turned up for their first data science and analytics summit. They were expecting a couple of hundred or so. But IBM is quite different in terms of its focus on this area. $16 billion in analytics-oriented acquisitions. That was as of last year. Maybe there are more now. Very strong on analytics in professional services. And I heard last week the details of a program that they have for internal decision-making on demand management, and it is quite impressive. They use a little company down in San Diego called Modern Analytics, which does machine learning, 3,000 different models a year. And this is not sort of, I was talking to Cisco, they said, well, we do 30,000 models a year, but they're changing, you know, one tiny little parameter in the models. This is really fresh, new models. And of course, the only way you can do that kind of industrialized analytics is with tools like machine learning. I have previously been slightly skeptical of machine learning just because I think it, because of its sort of black box-ish nature, means that humans are somewhat less inclined to make decisions on the basis of whatever comes out of a machine learning analysis, but it's just impossible to do anything else at this kind of scale. And certainly we see that in environments like online ad placement. I talked to a woman named Claudia Perlich, who's a really smart data scientist. She said, we do about 5,000 models a week. So hard to do that with the hypothesis-based, human hypothesis-based approach to analytics that certainly I was brought up upon. IBM is also finally, you know, these IT companies, if you had a warm breath, you could be invited to an event in Las Vegas. I think next month is the time they have all these big events in Las Vegas. Now they're getting quite analytical about, have you bought in the past? Are you from a company that's bought in the past? And then knowing who to really follow up on afterwards. So bringing science to a very unscientific area. So I think to sort of sum up about this 3.0 thing, lots of possibilities, but you need to start with an existing capability for data management and analytics. It would be sort of nutty for, I don't know, I was talking to some people at Kaiser recently about their approach to analytics, and they said, we'd love to do a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, but we can't get any of our data out of this epic system that we paid $3 billion to install. So, you have to have some of the fundamentals in place if this is going to work. Add a little bit of unstructured large volume data, a pinch of product service innovation. I think not everybody is going to be able to do database products and services, but you ought to be at least thinking about it in almost every industry. I mean, if it can work for GE and Bosch and Schneider, it can probably work for anybody. Dash of Hadoop, pinch of NoSQL, cook up some data in a high heat convection oven, get some speed. Embed it into sort of a well-balanced set of processes and systems, and promote the chef to chief analytics or digital or data officer. So I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes to talk about what I see. I think there are a lot of research opportunities in this space. I tend to be quite practitioner-oriented in my research. I'm often accused of being too academic for the practitioners and too practical for the academics, but I think there are fantastic opportunities for looking at how big data is being managed in organizations for different types of data, even things like genomic data that's been around for now a decade or so. I think we haven't really learned the lessons of that all that well. Data scientists, what kinds of skills do they really have? We know sort of the legend and the lore, but what are people actually being hired for, and what do they do when they get there? And of course, this idea that you have the superhuman data scientist that is the world's greatest hacker and world's greatest statistical analyst, and very good at dealing with high-powered decision makers, and lots of great communication skills and so on. Just a bit unlikely, I would say. It's not necessarily the null set in that Venn diagram, but it's pretty close. So what are the right team configurations? Do you need sort of 2 of those in particular individuals, or 3 skills, or whatever? And where do you find them, other than, of course, the Berkeley iSchool? In terms of data products and services, there was a good article by a friend of mine at Northeastern, Mike Zach, and one of his colleagues in Sloan Management Review, called The Design and Development of Database Products and Services, I think in 1996. But the world has moved along a lot since then, and I think we need to research that issue more. In what settings do they occur? A lot of these things are given away by online companies. People you may know, it's free, Zestimates are free. Obviously, if you have an advertising-based model, they draw a number of people, but what kinds of products draw the most people? I think some really fantastic opportunities there. And then how's it reshaping in industrial products industries? I think that's probably the biggest transformation. I was talking recently to the Dave Kohler, who was the president, I think, of Kohler, and he was telling me, oh yeah, we're into this. We have a Bluetooth-based shower head now. It's everywhere. I just did a little study on big data in the travel industry, and it was a little sobering. Not that many airlines are doing much, but you have some, certainly the online travel agents and so on are doing quite amazing things. I love this one company in the Bay Area called HipMonk. Anybody know about HipMonk? I'm not quite hip enough to use HipMonk, but it has, instead of ranking flights by cost, which everybody else does, it ranks them by the agony index, if you want it to, which is just how painful is it to, how often is it late, how many stops, etc. And for hotels, there is an ecstasy index. I guess the idea is that no airline could inspire ecstasy, but hotels can. So I think some really interesting database products and services in the online space there, but how about in the rest? We haven't seen too much of that. Marketing, I think, is being transformed every second by this stuff. somewhat less so supply chain. I was with a bunch of HR managers yesterday in Chicago, and things are moving there, but somewhat more glacially, I would say, in terms of using an analytics-based approach to human resources. Finally, I, as a Babson professor, I have to put up there, how's this changing entrepreneurship? And I am quite interested in, how does big data entrepreneurship differ from other types? My entrepreneurship division colleagues at Babson tell me all entrepreneurship is alike. It doesn't matter what the topic is that they're entrepreneurs of, but I'm not sure I believe that. So I may actually study that a bit. So, we're kind of adrift on a sea of data. That's one of my favorite images. Those are little ones and zeros, I think, in there. But a lot of questions around, how hard is this data science stuff? I must say, when I started studying data scientists, it was not a job that I wanted. It seemed more like data plumbing than anything else to me. It was a lot of really dirty activity around pulling data together from various sources and cleaning it and matching it and so on. If data science becomes yet another silo, which I don't think it is in big companies, but maybe in smaller organizations, how do we integrate it? Of course, tons of privacy and security implications. How do we get to more sophisticated analytics and solve the big data equals small math problem? Integrating the outcome with our processes and systems. How do we do architecture and governance for big data? I think, some people would have thought big data governance was an oxymoron, but big companies are quite interested in it. And is there really a people shortage? My friends and former colleagues at McKinsey said, we have this huge shortage a couple of years ago in their big data report. It's been quoted literally probably hundreds of thousands of times. But I talked to the guy who did this analysis, and he said, well, let's just say it wasn't the most analytical work we've ever done to say that the world needs the U.S. needs 1.5 million data-savvy managers and so on. So I think we need a little bit more rigor and precision about all of these things if we're going to build our economy on the basis of it. So with that, as I say, I'm the tree shaker, not the jelly maker. I love this tree of numbers, but ask me a question or make a comment now, or send me an email, whatever you prefer.
Thank you very much. We do have time for I'll get started. Okay. So the last comment that you made about is it becoming another silo, it raises for me one of the interesting things that I thought you might mention, which is I think data is actually leading to internal reorganizations of companies.
Huh.
And that it's actually cutting across the silos, and that because different silos have different data, companies are having trouble, and so they're needing to reintegrate it, and they're needing to have teams of people that understand product development, that understand marketing, that understand finance, and that data scientists are part of a reorganization of the internal structure of the company.
That certainly makes sense to me, and I would love to see it. For example, in marketing, you see that fairly often because customer data. Everybody talks, we need a 360-degree view of customers, but customer data is partially in marketing, but partially in sales, partially in customer service. Maybe even in shipping and order management, and so developing an integrated perspective, I think, does demand some sort of, if not reorganization, at least, data stewardship that cuts across those boundaries. But, it certainly is a slow process for organizations to do anything about it.
Of course.
I saw some analysis suggesting that, this is by the Corporate Executive Board, they asked senior marketing executives in like 800 companies, when you want to make a decision about customers, what's the primary thing that you draw upon? Data and analytics was last in the list in frequency, well behind chance encounters with colleagues in the hall, stories about customers heard, from colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a, I don't know. Somebody once said progress in physics proceeds through a series of funerals. It may be progress in data proceeds the same way. I'm not sure. Paul?
Tom, thanks for the talk, a very nice talk. To play a little on your internal battle at Babson between the entrepreneurs and the large corporation. I mean, does this, we know that when we began with IT, the first thing was to sort of confuse information and transaction costs and say, because we have this stuff, businesses will get smaller and smaller.
Yeah, yeah.
And they didn't.
Right.
And in some sense, it is the same thing happening here.
It's a good thing that Dr. Coase just died, because everybody cited him as the reason they were going to get smaller and smaller.
And he, in fact, nicely said transaction costs are not communication costs. And I just want to hear, in some sense, what you're describing is almost demanding more integrated corporate structure. In fact, you seem to be talking towards that on the last stage. I don't know whether you were just elbowing your colleagues at Babson there. It seemed to be a more serious point.
Well, I do think that, I see it mostly in terms of analytical capabilities, which are by and large quite fragmented in companies. And so I see probably once a week some company will tell me, we're starting to get them together, we're starting to coordinate a little bit more, we're starting to, in some cases like Procter & Gamble, they have an entirely centralized analytics group that does fantastic work. So I would argue that, at least in certain cases, that would be a nice thing to happen. But I will leave it to much more capable business historians like yourself to see what really transpires. I just don't really see, people get very excited about this stuff, but I don't see it sort of effects rippling yet through, every aspect of how we organize things. And, there's so much hype about it. I was remembering over the last couple of weeks, over the last couple of months with all this Edward Snowden discussion, this idea that, the internet is going to free us all from political oppression, and it's going to overthrow all dictatorships. And, if anything, it seems to have created more of that sort of thing. And that Prescriptive Analytics, Shoshana Zuboff's book, In the Age of the Smart Machine, was all about this information panopticon of people looking at every job. And it's happening not just with transactional data, but with predictive analytics now. In a way, it's even scarier.
Data analytics, as a concept, it seems to me, presumes data management. And data management, some integrated idea and consistency of definitions, has been a problem as long as I can remember. At least
since God was a boy, I think, yeah. Yeah.
45 years ago at United Airlines, in looking at how you overhaul jet engines, the procurement department had a different part numbering structure than did the engineering department, and they had a different structure than did GE, who was supplying the engines in the first place. And I guess what that kind of a problem has existed forever. I'm sure it still exists. And I'd be interested in your perspective on the kind of evolution of stable data management, or the control of data management in these large firms, and particularly some that have been successful and not successful in moving through this analytical path you've been talking about.
Yeah, great question. And I think the answer to how you succeed with it doesn't have that much to do with technology. I think there are, I will talk to people on a fairly regular basis who say, yeah, we have a new tool not just for better analyzing data, but for better integrating data. And I think certainly technology for integrating data has not kept up with technology for processing and analyzing data. But I was teaching an executive program at Boston University on Monday with, I won't say who it is, but a very large oil company that would be known to everyone here. And I was talking about big data and analytics, and they said, well, yeah, it's a great idea. We have a lot of it, but totally fragmented. And one of the reasons it's totally fragmented is, we can't even agree on a definition for oil around here. Certainly not where it's located or what the grades of it are. And I haven't done much recently in this area, but I was very interested in this 10 or 15 years ago. And then people thought you could kind of address that issue by modeling. And there's this whole information engineering movement. The Defense Department spent probably $1 billion of our tax dollars on modeling data so as to solve that problem. But it seemed to me it was much more of a political and organizational issue than it was an engineering issue. And this company that I was with on Monday was they brought this up. I once wrote an article called Information Politics where I talked about different political models. This group started saying, one said we're an information anarchy environment, another said no, it's more feudal baronies. And we talked about those two models in this article. They were very common then. They're still apparently very common. I came across an oil company, a smaller exploration company, where the CEO said, henceforth, oil location will mean this and only this. If you use anything else, you are out of this company. It may be a bit dictatorial, but it at least recognizes how important it is to have kind of a common term and meaning for this sort of thing. I once, I don't know if maybe I didn't publish it, that's the reason. I always think that I'm going to get a call from the King of Sweden in October or whatever saying I've won the first Nobel Prize for information. It never happens, I don't know why, but for something I articulated at one point called Davenport's Law of Common Information, which is the more an organization knows or cares about a particular information entity, the less likely it is to agree on a common term and meaning for it. So this was first observed at American Airlines when they told me, oh, yeah, we have about 11 different meanings of the term airport around here. And then the next week, just by coincidence, I was at Union Pacific Railroad, and they said, we have huge debates about what's a train. And the Justice Department in the US, the week after, they said, we can't agree on what's a trial for our databases. So I thought, man, this is, the fact that this oil company couldn't agree on what constituted oil, that didn't surprise me at all.
That in part is a vocabulary issue.
Well, it is. It's a vocabulary issue, but it's a political and power issue in many cases as well. And I think it's a stupidity issue because a lot of organizations don't realize how important it is to agree upon that, and they don't ever address it. And when they do, it looks like some kind of schematic diagram for the latest Intel microprocessor, not, we agree that this means this and this means this and so on.
Earlier in your talk, you were talking about analytics tools and sort of dilemmas facing people. Do I do a proc reg, proc ANOVA on this? Do you see any way out of that dilemma in your taxonomy of different, versions of analytics? Is there a way out of that other than just knowing statistics better?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I think, I was talking about visual analytics before. In my new book, I thought, well, I will provide somebody else's taxonomy on when you use a certain type of visual analytics for a certain type of problem or set of variables or whatever. And I couldn't find anything. I was shocked that there wasn't a clear taxonomy of line chart when it's a time series or something like that. Maybe there is one, but I just couldn't find it. But I found that there were a couple of vendors, SAS is one of them, that is starting to, their SAS Visual Analytics will look at your data and say, okay, a line chart would be the most appropriate form of visual analytic for this type of data. And you can, of course, override it. I think you could do the same thing for statistics and say, okay, you appear to have categorical data, and maybe I ask you a question or two. Do you want to see relationships between just two variables or more than two variables? And you say, okay, that's a crosstab, and chi-square is going to be the goodness of fit test. So I think we could pretty easily take people through that kind of analysis with a sort of guided, a a guided analytic around analytics, but I don't think it exists, and not in any popular way.
And your end user for that, like who would the end user for that type of product be?
Well, it could be somebody, I mean, more and more, we're going to hope that business people with no strong analytical background are going to make more analytical decisions. So that would be the target user, I would say. Somebody who, if they ever took statistics, had forgotten most of it, which I think characterizes most business people. And so it would say, this test is appropriate, and here's probably also we should have some computed text. I think there might be a little bit of this to say, here's what the analysis means, and here are the assumptions behind your data. And by the way, if those assumptions change, this model won't be applicable anymore.
I mean, I would just, because the real world is so messy that oftentimes, like, normal statistical models, when you put them in, or when you put your data in, the data is messy, it violates those assumptions, and the caveats are even more important than,
Yeah.
than the like bottles.
Well, you could do that pretty easily and say, oh, by the way, your data does not have a normal distribution, so you need to be looking at non-parametric statistics from the beginning. I don't think that there are widely used statistical tools that tell you that sort of thing. I'm not quite sure why, frankly, but I don't know. My first job was doing statistical computing at Harvard University, and I used to kind of observe people doing this all the time. And what did they do? They'd read the SAS and SPSS manuals because they're fairly easy to use and so on. I don't think we've progressed all that much since then. We don't read manuals anymore, so we've probably gone backwards.
I'm interested in the relative cost of implementing an information 3.0 structure anew in a new company environment versus making a transformation in a legacy company. Are there industries where that difference would be compelling enough that we would expect that new companies are going to come along and displace existing companies?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer, of course, but we haven't really had any yet. I mean, there are a fair number of companies that started out as 2.0 companies that I say are coming into 3.0 by focusing on internal decisions as well. But I mean, I think probably if you had a good business idea and a good business model, it would be a great idea to start from the beginning of saying, okay, not only am I going to create database products and services, but I'm going to make really smart decisions and use sort of industrial analytics and embedded analytical decision making for most of the key decisions in the organization. So yeah, I think it would probably work pretty well, but being an empirically oriented person, I haven't seen anything like that yet, so I'm not sure.
Let's give Tom another round.
Thank you.